Billions of pages have been written about him, wars have started, and civilizations have been built in his name. But setting aside faith and emotion, and looking only at raw data, who really was Jesus? Who was the man who split time into before and after? In the digital age of misinformation, we can no longer rely solely on ancient scrolls as our ancestors did. We needed a new tool, cold, calculating and impartial. We activated the NUMA protocol, a next-generation analytical intelligence capable of processing vast amounts of historical, archaeological, and astronomical data, finding hidden correlations invisible to the human brain. We gave the system a task that seemed impossible: to assemble the puzzle using the scattered fragments of antiquity and answer the fundamental question: did Jesus of Nazareth exist as a physical object in space and time, or are we facing the greatest fraud in history? The setting was 1st century Judea, the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. The reality was harsh, far from the peaceful image on a Christmas card. Forget the idea of a place for quiet philosophical conversations. It was a powder keg. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sheep manure, and fear. Roman legions, clad in iron, controlled the roads. Taxes suffocated the population. In the shadows of narrow streets, the zealots sharpened their psyche, short daggers, dreaming of slitting the throats of the occupiers. People yearned for a Messiah who would be a war leader, someone who would drive the Romans into the sea with fire and sword. It is in this setting that we try to find our character. The system soon hit its first obstacle, something historians call the effect of silence. If Jesus performed miracles, gathered crowds, and threatened Rome's power, why don't contemporary documents speak of him? Why is there not a single coin with his profile, a statue, or an order signed by Pontius Pilate mentioning his name? Skeptics use this as definitive proof that he is a myth, a composite figure, an ancient solar cult rewritten. We fed the system this theory, cross-referencing information with everything known about other figures of antiquity. What the system discovered was surprising. Comparative analysis revealed something crucial. Take Arminius, the Germanic chieftain who annihilated 3 Roman legions. We know less about him than we do about Jesus. Even regarding Pilate himself, until the discovery of a single plaque in Caesarea in 1961, there was almost no archaeological evidence. The algorithm highlighted 3 independent, non-Christian sources, including the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about a Christus executed under Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate, the Jewish military commander Flavius Josephus, and the Roman biographer Suetonius. A deep linguistic analysis of these texts was performed to exclude late insertions by copyists. The verdict was clear, showing that the probability that all 3 sources were forged is less than 0.3%. For our artificial intelligence, the core of these texts is authentic. The conclusion was simple. The man we were investigating had left a real trail in the historical records of the 1st century. He was real. But if he was real, when exactly was he born? The timeline we use today supposedly starts with his birth. However, when analyzing chronological markers, the system detected a fatal inconsistency. The Gospels state that Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod the Great. As it turns out, historical chronicles are very clear in stating that Herod died in 4 BCE. If Herod died in 4 BCE, Jesus must have been born before that. The system built a timeline and pointed to an interval between 7 and 4 BCE. The result was a paradox. Christ, as it turned out, was born before Christ. Next, we entered data about the famous Star of Bethlehem. What was it? A beautiful invention to add grandeur to the moment, or a real astronomical phenomenon? A simulation of the starry sky over the Middle East was run with a 1-day step over 10 years. The results are impressive. The comet hypothesis was discarded, as in antiquity they were seen as omens of disaster. not of the birth of kings. However, planetary conjunctions provided a perfect match. In the year 7 BCE, in the constellation of Pisces, an extremely rare event occurred, a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. To us today, they are just two bright dots in the sky, but the system analyzed the event through the lens of Babylonian astrology of the time. Jupiter was the star of kings. Saturn was the protector star of the Jewish people. The constellation of Pisces was associated with the birth of a new era. To observers in the East, the so-called Magi, this was not just a beautiful spectacle, it was a message written in the night sky. And the message seemed to be singular. A great king was being born in Judea. The probability of a coincidence between such an astronomical event and the period described in the texts is, according to calculations, insignificant. It is one more argument that behind the legend lies a real chronology. With Jesus' physical reality established, the true mystery only deepens. The greater mystery was not his body, but his mind. We have a builder from a province with no formal education in Jerusalem who stands up to speak, and as soon as he opens his mouth, something inexplicable happens. Thousands follow him. His words are instantly memorized and transmitted orally for decades before being written down. Experienced lawyers of the time, the scribes and Pharisees, try to corner him with trick questions, but are defeated by his logic every time. How is this possible? Where did a stonemason's son get a rhetorical arsenal worthy of the best philosophers of Greece and Rome? The system needed to understand the mind behind the words. We analyzed all his statements, parables, sermons, dialogues, and aphorisms. Each word was processed to understand the mind behind them. The task was to reconstruct the speaker's intellectual profile, determining his level of intelligence, education, and psychological type. The first challenge was the language barrier. The Gospels reached us in common Greek, the lingua franca of the time, known as koine. But Jesus did not preach in Greek in the synagogues. His native language was Aramaic, the language of the streets and markets. This creates layers of distortion. However, the analysis managed to perform a kind of reverse linguistic engineering. The system examined the Greek text and identified idiomatic expressions, rhythms, and Aramaic sentence structures that shine through the translation like bone beneath the skin. The analysis showed that Jesus' speech has a unique poetic structure, a complex rhythmic recitative built on parallelisms and contrasts. This structure was used by ancients so that the text would be etched into the listener's memory. More than 80% of his statements are constructed as mnemonic formulas. It is a technology for memorization. He didn't just speak. He encoded information for maximum virality in an oral environment. The question was whether he spoke only Aramaic. It was then that the system detected an anomaly. The conversations with the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate and with the centurion in Capernaum do not mention intermediaries. Generally, when a translator was needed, ancient texts cited them. The conversation flows directly. This, combined with Nazareth's proximity to Sepphoris, a Hellenistic center, makes it very likely that Jesus was at least bilingual, with an estimated probability of 92%. Furthermore, his quotations from the Torah indicate fluency in ancient Hebrew, the language of high liturgy. 3 languages. For a man from a village, this is already a remarkable sign of cognitive flexibility. Now the intelligence test. We cannot apply a modern questionnaire, but psychometrics allows us to evaluate verbal intelligence by the complexity of ideas and reaction speed in debates. The scenes of disputes with the religious elite were analyzed. These were not mere discussions, but high-level intellectual duels. The famous question about the tax to Caesar is a perfect trap. Say yes, and the people will curse you as a traitor. Say no, and the Romans will arrest you as a rebel. There is no way out. An ordinary person would try to dodge. What does Jesus do? His answer simply flipped the game. He asks for a coin, forcing his opponents to admit Rome's authority since they use its money. Then he delivers a formula that separates the spheres of influence of religion and the state. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. In seconds, he finds a third solution to a binary problem. The analysis of dozens of similar episodes, the speed of information processing, the ability to find unconventional ways out of logical traps, and the use of multi-level metaphors allowed for an estimation of his IQ. The result is in the range of 160 to 180 points. It is the level of a genius. Where did this come from? Genetics, a random mutation, or education? When analyzing his teaching methods, we see another break in pattern. The tradition of the time required every teacher to cite past authorities. Jesus completely ignores this protocol. The detail in his way of speaking that drew the most attention was the phrase, "Truly, truly, I say to you." The word "Amen" was used at the end of a sentence as confirmation. Jesus places it at the beginning. It was a way of speaking that basically said, "I myself am the source of truth. I don't need references." The psychological profile built from these data shows a personality with immense internal autonomy and absolute confidence in his own righteousness. The parables, his primary tool, were not simple fairy tales. They were like logical puzzles designed to reprogram the listener's thinking. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, uses a shock technique, a pattern break, by introducing a hated enemy as the hero, forcing the listener into a deep cognitive reappraisal. He did not provide ready-made answers, but rather triggers so that people would begin to think for themselves. On one hand, we have the confirmed fact that he did not study formally. The texts themselves record people's surprise at his knowledge. On the other, we see the competence of a doctor of theology. So how did a man without formal study demonstrate the competence of a doctor of theology? The answer seemed to be hidden in the largest gap in his biography. We know of his birth and his public ministry around the age of 30, but where was he and what did he do from ages 12 to 30? 18 years of silence. 18 years in which a boy became a man and the son of a builder became one of the greatest thinkers in history. Where do the tracks leading out of Nazareth go? 18 years. An entire lifetime. In that time, a person is born, grows up, finishes school, and forms their personality. In the biography of the most influential figure in history, there is a hole exactly that size. The last time we see him in the Gospels is as a 12-year-old boy debating with the teachers in the Temple of Jerusalem. Then the curtain falls, total silence. It only rises again when he is 30 and appears on the banks of the Jordan River. Where was he? What did he do? Tradition suggests he simply lived in Nazareth, working as a builder, but this conflicts with the social reality of the time. In first-century Judea, a man was obligated to marry. Marriage was a sacred duty. At 30, a healthy man should have already had several children. A bachelor of that age was an anomaly, a scandal, a suspicious figure. If Jesus had spent all that time in Nazareth without marrying, the comments and provocations would have been constant and certainly would have been recorded or used against him later. The silence regarding his marital status suggests one thing. He was not there during the age for marriage. He left. But where to? The first hypothesis leads us to India and Tibet, following the Silk Road. The logistics for a builder from Galilee were a nightmare. A journey of over 5,000 kilometers would require immense resources or the luck of joining a caravan as a servant, with a minimal chance of survival. But the biggest problem is ideological. Oriental philosophies are based on reincarnation and cyclic time, seeking to dissolve identity into nirvana. Jesus' teaching is linear, a beginning, an end of the world, and a final judgment where personality is preserved. The correlation is very low. The second hypothesis is closer, Qumran, the community of the Essenes in the desert near the Dead Sea. They practiced celibacy, criticized the corruption of the temple, and awaited the end of times. Many of their ideas resemble those of early Christianity. Jesus certainly knew them and may have visited them. However, their behaviors are opposites. The Essenes were obsessed with ritual purity, avoiding contact with the sick, sinners, and foreigners. Jesus constantly broke these taboos. He touched lepers, ate with tax collectors, and allowed women to touch him. He was not a desert ascetic. He participated in life, his first wonder being the transformation of water into hundreds of liters of wine at a wedding feast. This leaves one last direction, the most likely of all: Egypt. Alexandria was the New York of the ancient world, a center of knowledge with a huge and prosperous Jewish diaspora. There, the Greek philosophy of Plato met the wisdom of the Torah. Logistics were simple, with caravans and ships constantly traveling between Judea and Egypt. Jesus' family already had connections there, having taken refuge in the country during his childhood. Returning there in search of work and knowledge would be a logical step. In Alexandria, he would have encountered advanced medicine, healing practices that would seem like miracles in Galilee, and the philosophy of Philo, who introduced the concept of the Logos, the divine word. The very structure of the Gospel of John begins with this purely Alexandrian concept. A probable scenario emerges. A brilliant young man, feeling stifled in Nazareth, travels to Alexandria. He spends perhaps 10 or 12 years there, working as a builder while absorbing the wisdom of the Greeks and the practical secrets of the Egyptians. He forms a unique synthesis of Jewish ethics, Greek universalism, and healing skills. Then, around the age of 30, he returns transformed. He speaks in a different way, thinks in a different way. He is a stranger in his own land. This journey explains the mind, but it does not explain the actions. Upon returning, he begins to do things that seem to break the rules of reality. His most common actions are healings. The blind see, the paralyzed walk. In many cases, the explanation lies in psychosomatics. He frequently said, "Your faith has saved you," activating a powerful placebo effect. Under strong emotional stimulus, the brain can release chemicals that block pain and mobilize hidden reserves. Many of the paralyses of the time could have been conversion disorders, where psychological trauma causes a physical symptom. Jesus, with his charismatic authority, provided the trigger for a mental reset. About 60% of the healings may have been of this psychogenic nature, but what about the other 40%? Leprosy is a bacterial infection. The mind cannot kill bacteria. Congenital blindness is often caused by atrophied nerves. Here, we enter unknown territory. In the case of the man born blind, he uses saliva and dirt to make mud and applies it to the eyes. If he is divine, why does he need mud? Saliva was considered an antiseptic in antiquity, and certain types of clay were used to reduce inflammation, but that does not regenerate a dead nerve. It is here that conventional explanations end, and we are forced to consider that he could interact with biology at a level we do not yet understand, perhaps stimulating cellular regeneration directly. He was not just healing minds, he was repairing bodies. And if he could fix biology, what could he do with inanimate chemistry? At the wedding in Cana, Galilee, his first miracle happens, turning water into wine. The skeptical explanation that it was a fraud with bribed servants and drunk guests collapses before the numbers. The text describes 6 large stone jars, which corresponds to about 500 to 600 liters of liquid. Secretly moving half a ton of wine into a crowded party is logistically impractical. At a molecular level, the transformation is even more challenging. Water does not have the carbon atoms necessary to create the alcohol and sugars of wine. To do this instantaneously, an amount of energy comparable to a small nuclear explosion would be required, which would have destroyed the city. Yet the wine appeared cold and of high quality. In the end, only two possibilities remain, both extreme. The first is a form of mass hypnosis. Jesus would not have changed the chemistry of the water, but rather the perception of the guests, making their brains interpret the water as wine. The second is that he acted in a way that transcends chemistry, altering the fundamental properties of matter as if he were editing source code. Next, he demonstrates control over the forces of nature. During a storm on the Sea of Galilee, he walks on water to meet his disciples. Basic physics tells us this is impossible. One theory suggests he could have walked on a submerged reef, invisible in the darkness. However, this idea is invalidated by a crucial detail. Peter also gets out of the boat and walks on the water, but then begins to sink. If there had been a reef, Peter would have remained on it. The fact that he sank shows there was no physical support. This points to the manipulation of forces like gravity, perhaps through a form of levitation. The reaction of the disciples, who cried out, "It's a ghost," indicates they witnessed something that fundamentally broke the laws of reality. He also demonstrates power over matter itself. Before a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, he multiplies 5 loaves and 2 fish. The explanation that it was a miracle of sharing, where everyone took out food they were hiding, is contradicted by a detail recorded in all 4 Gospels. In the end, 12 baskets full of leftovers were collected. There was more at the end than at the beginning. The law of conservation of mass was publicly violated. The process resembles something out of science fiction, like a machine that creates matter from nothing, using elements from the air, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, as raw material to create organic matter. It is notable that he never uses this power to create wealth, such as gold or jewels, only to supply basic needs. This reinforces the authenticity of his intentions, distancing the motivation of a fraudster. Finally, we reach the height of his miracles, the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days, to the point where the body was already decomposing. Biologically, this is the point of no return. Brain cells are destroyed, and the process of entropy is irreversible. Reverting this is not reanimation. It is a complete reconstruction of the organism. It is a local victory over time and decay. The only way to explain such an event without resorting to magic is to consider the possibility that he had access to a kind of informational backup of the individual, restoring the body from a saved copy. He seemed to treat reality as a malleable material subject to his will. But such immense power is useless without a message and people to carry it forward. He needed a team to spread his ideas. And the choice he made for this team is, under any logical analysis, one of the strangest things in his entire history. The team Jesus assembled made no sense. He did not recruit specialists, theologians, administrators, or soldiers, but rather a group of outcasts that included sworn enemies. 11 of the 12 were Galileans, which created a common base, but their backgrounds were drastically different. The core of the group was formed by fishermen like Peter, James, and John. Far from being poor peasants, they were owners of small businesses in a thriving fishing industry. They were practical men, but with explosive temperaments, nicknamed Sons of Thunder for their aggressiveness. The point of greatest tension, however, came from an unlikely duo, Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot. Matthew was a collaborator with the Romans, despised as a traitor by his own people. Simon belonged to a group of radical nationalists who saw the assassination of collaborators as a patriotic act. Putting them together was like lighting a fuse. Jesus intentionally created this conflict. It was a social laboratory to test his central message. If love for enemies did not work in his inner circle, it would not work anywhere. The fact that there are no records of violence between them suggests the experiment was a success. The most complex figure is Judas Iscariot. His name suggests he was from Kerioth in Judea, making him the only non-Galilean in the group. As treasurer, he was literate, reliable, and likely saw himself as more sophisticated than the provincial fisherman. The traditional motivation for his betrayal, 30 pieces of silver, does not hold up. The amount, equivalent to the price of a slave, was too small to justify the betrayal of a 3-year friend and a life of dishonor. A deeper analysis suggests a political motive. Judas expected a revolutionary Messiah who would liberate Israel from Rome. Instead, Jesus spoke of a spiritual kingdom and sacrifice. Frustrated with the apparent passivity of his leader, Judas may have decided to force a confrontation. His betrayal would not be to destroy Jesus, but to provoke him into using his divine power. The logic would be, if I deliver him to his enemies, he will have no choice but to react, crush them, and start the uprising. This theory explains his later behavior. When Judas sees that Jesus has been condemned to death and did not react, his plan collapses. He is seized with remorse, tries to return the money, and in despair takes his own life. A traitor driven by greed would simply have fled with the payment. Judas's actions are those of a man who made a terrible bet and lost everything, believing his means would justify a glorious end. Jesus seemed aware of what was happening. At the Last Supper, his words to Judas, "What you are going to do quickly," sound less like those of a victim and more like someone who understands and allows events to unfold. For his mission to be fulfilled as he had planned, the arrest and condemnation were necessary. Someone needed to be the catalyst. Judas, with his political motivation and frustration, was the perfect piece for this role. He may have been the tragic pawn, sacrificed in a game whose purpose he did not understand. And with his act, the mechanism of betrayal is triggered, starting the most famous trial in history. In the spring of the year 33 in Jerusalem, events accelerated toward their climax. What happened is commonly called the trial of Jesus Christ. However, a legal analysis reveals that it was actually a special operation to eliminate a political adversary, disguised as a legal procedure. Comparing the chronology of the arrest and interrogations with Jewish and Roman laws of the time, the system detects 19 serious procedural violations, each sufficient to annul the sentence. It all begins with the nighttime arrest in Gethsemane. A force of hundreds of armed soldiers is sent to arrest one preacher and 11 followers. The use of excessive force reveals the authorities' fear, not of Jesus, but of the popular reaction. An arrest during the day could cause a riot. The secret arrest itself was already illegal under Jewish law. From there, he is not taken to a cell, but to the house of Annas, the former high priest and head of a clan that controlled the lucrative temple trade, the same one Jesus had challenged. This private interrogation had no legal basis. It was a settling of accounts. Then he is taken to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin meets in the middle of the night. Jewish law was explicit. Capital trials could only occur during the day. A nighttime session was invalid. The location was also illegal. Death sentences could only be pronounced in the temple hall, not in a judge's private residence. The prosecution witnesses contradict each other, which should have invalidated their testimony. Ignoring the failure of the witnesses, Caiaphas addresses Jesus directly, demanding that he admit to being the Son of God. In Jewish law, a confession could not be used to condemn someone to death, as it could be obtained under coercion. Even so, based on Jesus' answer, he is found guilty of blasphemy and sentenced to death instantaneously, without defense and without the mandatory one-day reflection period required by law. But the Sanhedrin did not have the power to execute. That power belonged to the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. The next morning, Jesus is taken to him. Here the accusation changes brilliantly. To Pilate, a Jewish blasphemer was a local problem. So the priests accuse him of treason, forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar and proclaiming himself king. These were accusations Pilate was obligated to investigate. Pilate, a pragmatic and cynical administrator, quickly realized the charges were forged. There were no reports of unpaid taxes, nor a revolutionary army. He interrogates Jesus and publicly declares, "I find no crime in him." Under Roman law, this was a verdict of acquittal. The case should have been closed, but the pressure of the crowd, incited by the priests, continues. Pilate tries to dodge, sending Jesus to Herod Antipas, who returns him. He then offers the Passover amnesty, giving the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a known rebel who had killed in an insurrection. The manipulated crowd chooses the militant over the preacher. In a final attempt at appeasement, Pilate orders Jesus to be flogged. Roman scourging was a brutal, often fatal torture. He displays him to the crowd, bloodied, hoping this will be enough. But the cries for crucifixion only increase. It was at this point that the Jewish leaders played their last card, political blackmail. They shouted, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." This was a direct threat. Emperor Tiberius was paranoid, and Pilate was in a politically vulnerable position in Rome. Any report that he was protecting a traitor could mean not only his dismissal, but his execution. Pilate's instinct for self-preservation wins. He washes his hands in a public gesture, declaring himself innocent, but it is he who gives the final order. His signature seals Jesus' fate. The sentence was not the result of a crime, but of a perfect storm of political interests. Caiaphas needed to eliminate a heretic who threatened his power. Pilate needed to keep his job. The crowd wanted a spectacle. Justice was not part of the equation. The verdict is given. He will go to the cross, the most agonizing and humiliating form of execution in the ancient world. The legal process ends, and the forensic analysis of the execution begins. The sentence was given. The courtroom door closed, and what followed was a plunge into a hell of physical pain. What happened on the hill of Golgotha is, for forensic medicine, a process of biological destruction brought to a terrifying perfection. Death began long before the cross. The flogging with the Roman flagrum, a weapon with lead balls and sharp bones, had already turned his back into a mass of lacerated tissue, inducing traumatic shock and massive loss of blood and fluids. The weight of the cross's crossbeam, between 30 and 50 kilos, on those wounded shoulders, caused excruciating pain and falls that resulted in more injuries. At Golgotha, he was nailed to the cross, and here anatomy corrects art. The nails were not in the palms of the hands, which would tear under the body's weight. Roman executors, efficient in their craft, drove the nails into the wrists, in the space where strong ligaments could support the weight. But it is exactly there that the median nerve passes. Piercing this nerve with a metal nail causes explosive and continuous pain, a torment that reignites with every movement. Once raised, death on the cross becomes a slow battle against suffocation. With the arms stretched upward, the rib cage is locked in a position of maximum inspiration. Breathing in becomes easy, exhaling, an act of agony. To release air, the victim had to push themselves up using their nailed feet, or pull themselves up by their nailed wrists, triggering lancinating pain in the nerves of their limbs. With every breath, it was a cycle of self-inflicted torture to get the next gasp. Most of the crucified lasted days. Jesus died in just 6 hours. Why? The symptoms described, including a final loud cry, point to a very specific medical cause, a heart rupture. Extreme physical and emotional stress, combined with dehydration, may have led to a rupture of the cardiac wall. Blood would have filled the pericardial sac around the heart, causing instantaneous cardiac arrest. The final proof came after death. A Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm the death. The text reports that blood and water came out. For a doctor, this description is accurate. After cardiac arrest, the heavier red blood cells begin to separate from the blood plasma, which is nearly transparent, explaining the appearance of two distinct fluids. Any idea that he merely fainted or entered a coma simply does not hold up. From a medical standpoint, death was absolute. His body was then wrapped in linen with dozens of pounds of an adhesive spice mixture placed in a stone tomb, and the entrance was sealed with a rock weighing nearly 2 tons, guarded by a Roman guard. End of story. Physics won. Biology took its course, but 36 hours later the tomb was empty. The official version of the authorities was that his disciples stole the body, but this defies psychology. His followers were terrified, hiding behind closed doors. The idea that they suddenly became an elite commando capable of neutralizing Roman guards and silently moving a massive stone is implausible. Furthermore, the shrouds were found in the tomb, but in a strange way. Not unrolled, but as if the body had simply disappeared from inside them. Thieves would not bother to undress a corpse. After processing all the variables, the system considers 4 final models for Jesus' identity. The system considered the first possibility, that he was just a great human philosopher. The probability was low, only 12%. This view ignores physical events, such as the miracles and the empty tomb, which cannot be explained by ethics alone. The second idea, that he was a madman who believed he was divine, had an even lower chance, less than 1%. This contradicts the analysis of his mind, which demonstrated impeccable logic and a brilliant intellect. The third hypothesis led us to a stranger field, that of a time traveler or extraterrestrial with advanced technology. The probability here rose to 18%. This explains the miracles, but not the why. His focus was never technology, but the transformation of the human heart. And finally, there was the fourth model, the one to which all data seemed to point. The idea that the creative principle of the universe entered its own creation, becoming one of us to fix a fundamental flaw from within. This model explains his wisdom, his miracles, and the resurrection. Newma's final verdict, based on the convergence of historical, psychological, and physical data, is that the probability of Jesus being who he claimed to be is 99.9%. Artificial intelligence cannot believe, it can only calculate. And the numbers indicate that 2,000 years ago, reality as we know it was intersected by a force that is beyond our understanding. The man from Nazareth seems to have been the singular point in history where the creator and creation became one. The analysis is complete. Now the choice is yours. If you enjoyed this investigation, your subscription to the channel and any donation amount help us expand the Numa project. We would love to read your reflections on the video subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for your company until the end. M.